My name is Gene Sharp, and this is the work I do.
This is a technique of combat. It is a substitute for war and other violence.
As we speak, somebody is doing it in Iran. As we speak, somebody is doing it in Egypt. As we speak, somebody is doing it in Venezuela. I'm telling you the facts I know.
To be counted as a threat to a tyrant is a matter of pride, I would say. It means we're effective. It means we're relevant. It means out of this very small office, we produce work that threatens regimes.
Gene Sharp's tactics and theories are being practiced on the streets of Syria as we speak now.
Unless they have something instead of violence and war, they will go back for violence and war every time.
Gene, welcome.
I thank all of you. It's very good to get such a receptive. Violence in our world is so common and mostly accepted axiomatically that at times it seems to be an overwhelming, permanent part of political reality. But that is not the whole reality. During the past century and long before, at least back to the Romans, and I would argue before that, people from time to time have found another way to fight when they needed to fight. And in those specific situations, the use of violence shrank or disappeared because it simply wasn't needed anymore. The violence had been replaced with nonviolent struggle, or at least a forerunner of what we know as nonviolent struggle today. This is people power, the power that employs psychological, social, economic, and political weapons. Clearly, these means are very old. However, for the most part, nonviolent struggle has been viewed as only a minor exception to the accepted as responsible action in crises, that is violence. The sometimes undeniable accomplishments by the use of nonviolent action have been ignored or explained away without relevance to future major conflicts. Misunderstandings have been common. It has been thought by many people that effective future nonviolent struggles would require a charismatic leader, a Mahatma. That nonviolent struggle only works by conversion or melting the heart of your opponents. That in order to keep nonviolent discipline, it was necessary to be committed to moral nonviolence. That a wise course of action could only be charted by a single strategic genius. That violence works quickly, and that nonviolent means require much longer. And that the opponents who are extreme dictatorships need not worry, because nonviolent struggle can do nothing about dictatorships. and the opponents fear not violence, but they're not worried about nonviolent action. Because of the major nonviolent struggles in recent years and months and days, we now know that all of those views are false, all of them. The future now can therefore be different. The methods of nonviolent action are many, but they're really quite simple. People sometimes refuse to do what they've been required to do, and sometimes they do what has been forbidden to do. Over the centuries, people have expressed their protest by actions, often symbolic ones. At other times, people have refused to help to do something, to cooperate, or to obey. At other times, they have acted to disrupt the established social or political order. Large movements of people, groups, and institutions have used these types of action against an education, against a situation or policy they did not like, or they have acted to achieve a new positive goal. The words for these many types of action have been ones you're familiar with: picket, leaflet, march, strike, boycott, civil disobedience, embargo, stalling and obstruction, mutiny, hunger strike, sit-in, alternative economic institutions, and parallel government. The methods for which these methods have been used have included opposing unwanted changes, correcting grievances, achieving revolutionary goals. And sometimes the action lasted only a few days. Some remarkable downfall of dictators in Guatemala and El Salvador, for example, collapsed within 2 weeks. And the people say, nonviolence means take forever. Some struggles have lasted a year or more. And sometimes people using these means have been defeated. But more often than not, more often than might be expected, these resistors were partially or fully successful. How do these means work? Well, very rarely this type of struggle changes opinions and feelings. Conversion. However, the one example that I and others have used to illustrate conversion, according to new research done by Mary King in South India, it never happened that way. So that really wasn't a very good example. Sometimes a struggle ends with a compromise, as most labor strikes do, accommodation. Sometimes the opponents are forced by the changed reality to accept the resistors' demands, nonviolent coercion. For example, last February, in the face of national defiance, President Mubarak resigned. Rarely, repudiation and non-cooperation are so completely cut off the sources of power, the opponent's power, that the opponent regime falls completely apart. And no one is left with enough power even to resign. And that's disintegration. This occurred in the February 1917 Russian Revolution and the 1944 revolutions against military dictators in El Salvador and Guatemala. Nonviolent struggles have been used to achieve justice for oppressed minorities. The civil rights movement in the United States, for example, for working people, for women, religious groups, victims of dictators, colonial peoples, and others. Nonviolent struggles were waged in Nazi-occupied Denmark and Norway, where I used to live, and elsewhere, and even in Berlin to save Jews. And they saved Jews. The wives of Jewish men who had been arrested, some of them were already at the extermination camp, demonstrated on the streets of Berlin, and they got their husbands released and brought back even from the extermination camps. That's nonviolent struggle. In my youth, it was believed that the peoples of Eastern and Central Europe would be living under communist rule for decades, barring a Western military intervention. But now the peoples of Poland, East Germany, the former Czechoslovakia, and other countries are recognized as having freed themselves. Perhaps most remarkable of all have been the achievements of the little nations of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Their brave guerrilla wars had fought both Nazi and Soviet rule. All three had been annexed as republics of the Soviet Union. And yet, using nonviolent defiance, they exited the Soviet Union, suffering only 12 lives lost in Lithuania, 8 in Latvia, and none in Estonia. Compare that to Chechnya. In the former Soviet Union itself, a hardline coup d'etat in August 1991 was intended to stop the liberalization launched by Gorbachev. However, it was defeated by major protests and by non-cooperation. The use of nonviolent struggle in major conflicts has been expanding in recent decades, as has the knowledge of how to make it effective. New publications have helped this development with virtually no promotion. From Dictatorship to Democracy, a generic examination of how nonviolent struggle can destroy a dictatorship, is now in 34 languages. The Arab Spring and other developments demonstrate that the genie is out of the bottle. It cannot be put back again. The knowledge of how to cast off oppression nonviolently is now known and is spreading. The media frenzy at the Albert Einstein Institution last March and April about nonviolent struggle following events in Tunisia and Egypt consisted of 4 to 7 major interviews every day, 5 days a week for 6 weeks, which is probably over 160 interviews. That's not the amazing thing. The amazing thing is new reality that was revealed. These dozens of reporters arrived with an accurate, basic understanding of nonviolent struggle, and this was new. None of them came with the old false misunderstandings and preconceptions that in earlier years were nearly universal. There is other evidence of this expanded view of reality. And if you'll permit a personal note, my new highly unorthodox dictionary in its essays and its 825 defined terms challenges the pro-violence biases in our language, which we usually don't even recognize. The understandings of power and defense, and the paucity of clear words about nonviolent alternatives. By the way, this volume calls attention to the fact that the large official dictionary of the United States Department of Defense, and I've been checking those for quite a number of years, does not contain a definition of either defense or of national defense. It's whatever people want to call defense, even though it's aggression. My new dictionary will be published by Oxford University Press, November 1, as Sharp's Dictionary of Power and Struggle, Language of Civil Resistance in Conflicts. It is now becoming understood that political power is derived from identifiable sources. These include authority or legitimacy, human resources, individuals, groups, and institutions who obey, submit, and assist, skills and knowledge, intangible factors including habits of obedience, doctrines, and beliefs, material resources including economic, transportation, and communication systems, and sanctions, punishments provided by police, prisons, and military forces. And that all of those sources of political power are made available by the obedience, cooperation, and assistance of people, groups, and institutions. These are what a colleague of mine, Colonel Helvey, is called pillars of support. When that obedience and restriction of that cooperation is not merely restricted, but cut off, the survival of that regime is very doubtful. And this is true even of extreme dictatorships. Without those 6 sources of power, even a dictatorship or other system of oppression dies of political starvation. Violence is therefore not needed. The objective of this type of struggle is not to kill and destroy, but to paralyze and disintegrate. The new means of communication have been used on websites and emails and all that kind of thing, as you are more familiar with than perhaps I am. But that's all very good. But we need to remember that the technologies does not tell anyone what to do. It has in some ways been demonstrated that the opponents have already used that technology for their own purposes. For example, in Sudan, people received on their cell phones a message to go to protest in such and such a square. And when they got there, they were all arrested. Nonviolent struggle has requirements for success. And without those requirements, it's sometimes defeated. That happens especially when people are unprepared, frightened, mix in violence, or timid. However, when well prepared, when brave, disciplined people act with a strategy, the chances of its success are strong. This growing capacity of nonviolent struggle never produces miracles, but it can bring significant successes. These successes need to be handled wisely. The hard-won gains achieved by nonviolent struggle must not be later permitted to be stolen, either incrementally, as appears to be happening in Egypt, or by a coup d'etat. And we have, to my knowledge, the only guidebook to how to prevent and defeat coup d'etat that exists. Foreign military intervention in these conflicts is dangerous. Whether the intervention is intended to assist the nonviolent revolution, to help to defeat it, or to achieve the other aims of the interveners. The intervening government may now, for example, want other people to learn from this example how they too can achieve greater freedom or justice. Repressive governments are now often well aware of the threat to their domination that is posed by people who want to be free and will use nonviolent struggle to gain their freedom. Oppressive rulers can be expected to behave desperately and brutally. It's not a surprise when their control is threatened. Sometimes autocratic rulers openly admit their alarm at the spread of the knowledge of nonviolent struggle. A future of domination, the rule of violence, and popular helplessness is not inevitable. We now have the knowledge needed to block that sad future, if we have the will to use it. We can block the installation of new dictatorships, and we can share knowledge of how to destroy existing dictatorships. We are now at a new stage in the practice and potential of nonviolent struggle. If we take the wise and responsible steps in the coming months and years, the future can reveal achievements far beyond our present ability to imagine them.
Jim, thank you very much for that. I think part of the appeal of your theories and of your teachings has been the seeming simplicity of the idea that if you stop obeying a dictatorship, the dictatorship will fall. It sounds so simple that some people think there's some kind of a trick to it. Yet I think in your research you have shown that from Burma to Serbia to Georgia to Kyrgyzstan to the Arab Spring these movements can catch on and can be incredibly devastating to dictatorial regimes, which is exactly why they fear those kinds of uprisings. It's like showing up for a fight with a heavyweight boxer and winning without ever putting on the gloves. But I think there's an important point we have to make here, is that sometimes nonviolent struggle has achieved fewer results. I mean, for every Egypt and Tunisia, there's Syria and Libya, where nonviolent struggles have morphed into something much more sinister with no clear sort of resolution in sight. So I wanted to ask you whether you think some entrenched regimes, and we can name names, but we all know what they are, and there are quite a few of them in the world, have been so successful in snuffing out any semblance of opposition, whether it's online or in people's kitchens or anywhere else, that nonviolent struggle has perhaps run its course in those societies? Or do you think they just have not tried hard enough?
That's too simplistic. And Syria is very different from Libya. In Libya, you had very quickly a military intervention. One of Gaddafi's generals, with his troops and guns, changed sides, supposedly. I have a suspicion he was an extreme agent provocateur, and he was later killed in the rebel camp. And once foreign military assistance was brought by NATO and the United States and France and all the rest, that wasn't nonviolent struggle anymore. And that kind of thing is when violence can wreck a nonviolent struggle movement. So that's not a good example. In Syria, they're still going. I have been startled and amazed at not only the nonviolent discipline, only scattered violence. In the midst of all kinds of killings almost every day by people who say, we're not afraid. This is what Gandhi was trying to tell the Indians: don't be afraid. Cast off fear. And I always honestly thought, well, he's being a little romantic and naive. And the Syrians and others have said, we are not afraid anymore, and that's what terrifies the dictators. That's why the brutality is so great in Syria. They think if they're only brutal enough, the resistance will collapse. And so far, the dictators have been proved wrong. But this is not easy. If you have people within your movement who do not keep discipline, who decide to do this or that, who you don't have a plan, you don't have a strategy, how the hell are you going to win? And yet people try to do that all the time. But they have to learn what makes it effective and what makes it fail, and then do the things that make it successful. In the end of my big book from a long time ago, The Politics of Nonviolent Action, in the last pages, I think I have this 30 or 35 specific factors that contribute to whether the struggle is success or failure. And you have to fulfill the factors that bring you success in order to win. But it can be done, and it's being done increasingly, more and more.
Thank you, Gene. I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. If anyone wants to step up to the microphones in the aisles. Let's go ahead.
Thank you. It was a very moving presentation. I fluctuate between a kind of optimism that Cory Booker would have talked about to a sort of pessimism when it comes to the more repressive Asian societies, in particular China, where there is both economic power of a kind of unprecedented type before that is coupled with a thousands-of-year-old culture that is very centralized. And I'm curious if there's a chance for movement even in my lifetime. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
There also are major sources of nonviolent struggle from China centuries ago. And I was in Tiananmen Square the night the troops came in. So I'm not naive. That system also is vulnerable. Otherwise, why would the Chinese government be so frightened of nonviolent struggle that they establish whole sections, I've been told, whole departments of how to defeat nonviolent struggle, accepted it as testimony to the power they fear coming from the people and from nonviolent struggle. You have to learn how to do it skillfully. If you were going to fight a war violently, you don't go to all the neighborhood bars and get all the guys out of there saying, let's go fight a war. But that's about the way nonviolent struggle has been conducted over the centuries. People were improvising. They didn't know what the hell they were doing. What would make it effective? What should they be aware of? Who was this guy who was urging violence? They didn't know he was a tool of the political police. It's happened in the Russian Empire, the third section, repeatedly. It's happened even, I'm told, by the Gestapo doing that. Dictators and rulers who fear the power of people will do their damnedest to defeat it. And you have to know how to be smarter than they are and more courageous and more skilled in what you do.
Any more questions for Gene? Please go ahead.
You were there first.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Esther. Mr. Sharp, your work is incredibly important, and you've expressed it so well. What happens once a regime has fallen? What is the book that describes, or what are the rules that describe how you create excellent civic society? Because we're all looking at the Arab Spring and other places in the world and worried about what happens next. So what are some of the ground rules for creating, from those roots, a great society?
You're wise to be worried. I can't spell it all out. There are people who specialize in the building and construction of democratic institutions. I haven't been able to do that. I've one or two other things I've been doing for the last X years. But in the end of my From Dictatorship to Democracy, I warn about that stage. That this is the time that the Bolsheviks seize control in Russia after the successful nonviolent February Revolution, after some months of confusion and weakness of the new constitutional government. Then the Bolsheviks, with Trotsky's help, staged a coup d'etat. This is how the Ayatollahs, after the successful nonviolent revolution against the Shah, staged a seizure of power and established a repressive regime in Iran. And really, quite seriously, this book that we have, it's only about 40 or 50 pages, I think. It's a guide, the steps that can be taken to prevent a coup d'etat, not always military, often political, and some combination. And how to defeat it if the coup is attempted. There have been actual historical cases which we have drawn upon. How to defeat coup d'etat when people were, in those cases, only improvising. There was a case in Germany in 1920 against the Kapusch, a monarchist military coup d'etat, which was defeated by non-cooperation in the general strike, by the defeat of the generals Putsch in Algiers against the French government, Charles de Gaulle's French government, and yet through the non-coercion and defiance of people in France, massive demonstrations, and in Algiers, in which people in the Air Force in France helped to block that coup d'etat by flying the planes out so the Putschers could not use the airplanes to go back and help seize power in Paris. These cases, I told not to, you didn't hear me talking about morals or ethics or do be right and don't do wrong. None of that. I try to learn from what has actually happened and how people have shown how other people in the future can do those things more skillfully and more effectively and begin to put that available.
There's an interesting aside here. You mentioned that book, Anti-Coup, when Hugo Chavez gave you a shout out by name a couple of years ago in Venezuelan national TV, saying you were fomenting a revolution against him. I think I remember you advised him to get your book about how to prevent a coup instead.
Yeah, we had no request.
Very wise.
We had no request from Chavez.
But I think there are a couple more questions.
You see what would happen? You know why he didn't? Because the same methods to block a coup d'etat could be used to oust Chavez. the same nonviolent, non-coercion defiance method, and he knew it.
Please go ahead.
So I was going to say that Jerry had asked my question, but the question I'd like to ask is, it's not just about regime change, getting rid of a good regime or a bad regime. It's how do you build a regime that is in fact legitimate, that the people support, and that has the right culture to make it persist?
That's what many people have been working on for a good number of centuries. And I would refer you to what they have come up with. They're not always right, they're not always perfect, but you can learn a lot from them. And since I was already doing that, I haven't attempted to repeat their good deeds.
That has bedeviling me and many other folks is this country has a history of people taking nonviolent action to effect change. You referenced the civil rights movement, and we've, I think it's fair to say that the Vietnam War and the change in policy. What has happened in this country that we seem no longer to be willing to demonstrate, to go on marches? What in your estimation is happening that with this country at the moment? It's worked in the past, and yet we seem to be in a number of very difficult issues, many of which were discussed by the panelists this morning, and we seem somewhat apathetic about them. What is your explanation for that? I know it's a tough one.
I'm not a great scholar of the present condition of American society, but nonviolence so is not something you do all the time, forever. You have to have a good reason. And some people don't feel a good reason, or they find some other way to express their grievances. Nonviolence so should be used mostly in the extreme situations when things might be so bad that people might say you have to go to violence. People do not go to nonviolence so easily. But how you stir people up in the present situation and malaise of thinking, and I'm worried about that as you are. But I'm not someone who can tell you how to solve that. Maybe that's your job.
That's a fascinating subject, and obviously with all the revolutions still ongoing, plenty to talk about. Unfortunately, once again, we have to wrap it up, but I would like to thank you on behalf of the audience for your insights and for all the work you've done. Thank you.